people will join gradually. I am Alakh Sharma, Director of Institute for Human Development, who is chairing this session. So we have nearly 2 hours, less than 2 hours for this session. There are 4 speakers. 3 are listed in the program. 1 speaker, due to some reasons, she has been allocated in this session, Magda, so there are 4. Welcome. Okay. Yeah, welcome. So there are 4 speakers. I think I would request all the speakers to take about 15 minutes, definitely 15 minutes, not less than that, and if we wish, 2 minutes extra, so that we'll have towards the end discussions of 45 minutes. We'll have time for discussions as also. So if you can complete it in 15 minutes, I'll be very happy. Otherwise, take extra 2.5 minutes more. So I will start without wasting time. You are Luis Campos from Argentina, who is presenting a paper on the importance of migrant workers in 21st century. If trade unions don't take them into account, then Mr. Trump will do it. Very interesting title indeed. So please, go on. You are from which institution in Argentina? You are from which place in Argentina?
From Buenos Aires, from the Argentinian Workers Union.
Okay, okay.
Hello everyone. Just not to waste too much time. My name is Luis Campos. I'm from the Argentinian Workers Union. I will present some data and some discussions about migrations at the global level. Firstly, I will just briefly describe the main causes of migrations. Then I will go to some figures about the main characteristics of the current phase of migration at the global level. And after that, I will try to introduce some discussions about the responses that both states and trade unions are giving to migrations. So, first of all, a brief description of the main causes of migrations, because usually we think about migrations as a consequence of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And of course, these are important factors of migrations. We can call them the push factors of migrations, but they cannot explain migrations without any other kind of reasons, particularly the pull factors, which are the need of cheap labor force at destination countries. Not only is unemployment, poverty, or inequality at the origin countries, but also the need of cheap labor force at destination countries, and also the population aging at destination country. And there are also some factors that we have to highlight as structural causes of migrations, which are, for example, non-economical reasons, particularly the wars, the consequences of wars, and environmental changes, and also the linkages between destination and origin countries. For example, one of them has been studied and is the impact of the foreign direct investment in origin countries, and which kind of linkages this kind of investment create in order to facilitate the migration from the destination of the investment and turn these countries into origin countries of migration. But the main point of this is that migrations are inevitable. We cannot stop migrations, and migrations will increase regardless which kind of migratory policy is implemented by national states. I think that this is one of the main points that we have to take into account when we discuss issues of migration. Okay, what about the current phase of migrations? First of all, we have to recognize that migrations are started longer before the national states or trade unions. Migrations are part of our nature as human beings. We have moved from one place to another one since we arrived to this land. So I think that this is one important point, because both states and national and trade unions could not be able to stop this kind of human mobility. But of course, in the current phase of migration, we should consider different situations, which are particularly can explain this, the particularities of this phase of migration. So I will show you some figures quickly about the numbers of migrations nowadays, and some other issues that I would like to highlight here. Okay, well, you don't have to look at the numbers. If you want to see the numbers in more detail, we can go to the paper. But this here are the current numbers of migrations in the last 25 years, and the important thing here is that the stock of international migrants is increasing rapidly. So between the average annual changes in migrant stock double from the first decade of this century compared to the 90s. So the number of migrants globally is increasing rapidly. And also it's important to highlight that the region that is facing this process with more intensity is Asia. Asia is the most important region, both as origin and destination countries. So now, again, small numbers, but the most important here you can cross origin regions with destination regions. And the most important thing here is that the flows of migrations, the most important flows of migrations are intra-regional. You know, when we think, for example, the migration in Europe, and we think about the African migration or this Latin American migration to Europe or the Asian migration to Europe, but most of 50% of migrants in Europe are they come from European countries. So more than half of human mobility in Europe is intra-regional migration. So we have to take into account this seriously, and also that the same happens in Asia and in Africa. The most part of migration is intra-regional migration. Some numbers about the labor market and the gaps between migrant workers and national workers. Here we can see the wage gap between foreign workers and native workers in the OECD countries. Of course, as you will know, migrant workers earn less wages than national workers. The same we can say for the unemployment gap, because the migrant workers experience higher rates of unemployment, at least in the OECD countries. And another things that I would like to stress regarding the current phase of migration is that there are new dynamics that we have to take into account. First of all, the traditional division between origin countries and destination countries seems not to be interesting to describe migrations nowadays, because countries are changing, and most of them are at the same time origin countries, transit countries, and destination countries of migration. For example, in Mexico, we can see that there are many Mexicans that migrate from Mexico to the United States, but at the same time, Mexico is a transit country for many Central American migrants that are going to the United States. And at the same time, Mexico is also a destination country for most of these Central American migrants. So this traditional and strict separation between origin countries and destination countries seems not to be useful to understand migrations nowadays. And then we can analyze region by region which are the main challenges. I'm not going to go in detail of this because of time restrictions. But well, what about the state responses to migration? First of all, we have to separate or we have to analyze the different levels of responses, because at the international level, at the global level, states prepare some formal statements with no further commitments. The most known of these responses are the New York Declaration and the preparation of the Global Compact on migrant rights for 2018, and also the discussions that are taking place at the international labor organizations with Convention 97 and Convention 143 that the ILO is trying to campaign in order to get more ratifications for those conventions. But those statements has no further commitments in order to protect migrants' rights. And at the same time, at this global level, states are trying to strengthen orderly migration systems. And these orderly migration systems subordinate the needs of migrant workers at origin countries to the needs of labor markets at destination countries. And this is a problem because if you subordinate the needs of migrants at origin countries to the needs of labor markets at destination countries, you will not stop migration, and you will just put barriers, and you will create some other channels for migrants that wants to go to destination countries. But well, the most important thing here is states are not only responding to migrations at the global level, but also at the regional, but at the national level. And at the national level, they don't recognize rights for migrants anywhere. And we can see, for example, that at the national level, states are building walls and fences against human mobility. The most well-known wall nowadays is the wall that separates the United States from Mexico. And it's not a new wall. Mr. Trump is enlarging it, but it existed for many years ago. So this is the most well-known. But it's not only the only. It is not the only wall in the world to protect states from migrants, from foreigners. So let's go to Europe. We have plenty of walls in Europe. Some of them are quite old. The one that separates Spain from Morocco in Ceuta and Melilla, in the north of Morocco. But also inside Europe we have some walls. Some of them quite new. Many of them are preventing the migration from Syrians and from people from Middle East. But also, for example, there is a wall separating France from Great Britain in order to prevent migrants and asylum seekers in Calais to go to Great Britain. So this is the situation in Europe. But of course, you would say, okay, this is a problem of poor people from developing countries trying to reach wealth and trying to reach the heaven in the central countries. Well, okay, this is not the case, because there are also walls and fences all around the world, even in developing countries. Here we have some classical walls, the one that separates Israel from Palestine, but also Palestine from Egypt. And we have walls here in Asia that separates country and prevent country from migration, and also in Africa, for example, between Botswana and Zimbabwe. Okay, here we have the world with so many walls. These are not the only walls in the world, but it shows us quite much about the national responses of migration. Also, another thing that we that states have developed is the building of detention centers for migrants, and we can find this kind of detention centers all around the world. In Latin America, in Mexico, in the United States, in Europe, in so many countries. Almost every country has its detention center for migrants and asylum seekers. In Asia, we have this kind of centers. In Oceania, Australia has built 2 detention centers, one in Nauru and one in Papua New Guinea. These are centers for detained asylum seekers, and it's a kind of extraterritorialization of the migration control. So this is the second level of the national responses to migration. And the third one is changes in legislation. Here I just put 3 examples: the United States, Spain, and Argentina, which recently had approved restrictive legislation against migration. But well, this was the state responses to migration. What about trade unions? And within trade unions, I would like to say that there are 2 different types of responses, or maybe 3 types. The first one, I don't want to describe this, is the fascist response to migration. So, but I would like to, I didn't want to go further into this kind of response, but there are 2 other groups. One of them is the conservative stance, and the other one is the progressive stance. And the conservative one says that, okay, trade unions should focus in defending national workers and migrant workers, but only in regular status. This is the conservative one. The progressive one says, okay, well, we should organize workers regardless their nationality, and of course, we should organize migrant workers regardless their migratory status, no matter if they are in regular or irregular status. But in both cases, they admit that states should increase measures in order to prevent irregular migration from origin countries. Of course, in the conservative stance, say it loudly. The progressive or trade unions say this in low voice. They don't want to admit openly that they want to prevent irregular migration, but they said, okay, we should prevent this kind of migration because it is pressuring to the national labor markets. But the problem is that both perspectives adopt national approaches to migration. They are just defending the migrants when they are in the national territory. But they don't want most workers coming to their territories because of this pressure on the labor market. And as we said, we won't be able to stop migration. So if trade unions build this kind of national approach to migration, I think that we are running the risk of contributing to strengthen political perspective based on nationality. And the results of this risk are a threat to everybody, not only to migrant workers. So, what shall we do? And I will end with this. First of all, I would like to say again that national states and trade unions approaches are ineffective to respond to the nature of the current phase of migrations. In the context of an increasing economic integration at the global level, migrations will tend to grow because, first of all, the structural reasons of migration, we spoke about this a few minutes ago, and then because of a tendency of the capitalism, which is the production of a relative surplus population all around the world. Migrations are also responding to this tendency of capitalism. So, for trade unions, we are facing a dilemma. We can continue supporting strategies based on nationality. We will be just trying to defend something which has no defense, or we can start again to think about internationalism, and we can start again to think about what we will do with our borders. What is the trade union position on borders and on national states? Thanks.
Thank you for highlighting the role of trade unions in this kind of migration and the challenge before the trade unions. So your questions, comments are welcome. Pardon? Okay. That can be after presentation, but I think many people will forget also what we have spoken. So anyway, the view would be also that all that is fine. So second presentation is, many people will forget what he has said. So, yes, Professor Webster. Professor Webster will make a presentation on rebuilding the trade union movement through power resources.
Right, good afternoon, colleagues. It's well known that the traditional trade union movement is on decline, and indeed for some people it's the end of labour, a very pessimistic view. I want this afternoon to introduce a note of optimism by focusing on two cases of successful revitalization. I'll compare them with two examples of failure, but they come from the unlikely space of Africa. And let me, what I want to do here is introduce an analytical framework which places at the center of its analysis the concept of power. Power defined simply as getting someone to do something that they don't want to do. At the center of the trade union is collective power. And the question really is how to strategically use that power. And what I want to suggest to you, drawing on a range of scholarship that goes back some years on trying to identify different sources of power. And the classic center of power, of course, is structural. Put simply, the power to disrupt. That's at the core, historically, of the construction of the labor movement. And of course this is linked to the second dimension of power, which is the ability to organize collectively, what is called associational power. Now these two concepts have been well developed by Eric Owen Wright initially and Beverly Silver. But I think in the process of reflecting on these sources of power, labor scholars have begun to identify two other sources of power. The first, or the third source of power is what we could call societal power. Essentially, societal power is the ability to mobilize public support through the media or through alliances with social movements, coalitions. It's the public discourse. That's a key source of power that I'd like to demonstrate here. And finally, a fourth source of power, which interestingly, I think it was very first developed when this notion of power resources traveled to Germany, and institutional power, in other words, the power that derives from institutions and law, the compromises that you make that can consolidate and ensure that power is made more permanent through law. So that's the analytic framework I want you to bear in mind as I take you down this intellectual journey, applying the power resources approach. And I'm going to take 4 case studies of organizational responses to, which is at the center of the challenge to organized labor, which is growing informalization, precariety. But the particular challenge that we're going to focus on is the divide between the informal and the formal economy. And I want to show how unions and why they are crossing that divide. The first case there is a failed attempt at organizing clothing workers in the inner city of Johannesburg, my home city. The second example I want to give to you is a strike, spontaneous, if you like, informally organized amongst wine farmers in the Western Cape, which was not sustainable. Those are going to be 2 examples, if you like, inverted commas, of failure. The 2 other examples I want to draw on is based on the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Trade Unions in Transformation project, and you'll see there a link if you want to find the 2 case studies that I'm going to draw on. The one is on textile workers in Nigeria who successfully rebuilt the union, and the other one is the border drivers. Now, border drivers, I'll explain to you, are essentially guys on motorcycles, self-employed, informal workers in the city of Kampala in Uganda. Okay, let me here you see my first case study. This is a typical sweatshop in the inner city of Johannesburg. Those are undocumented migrant workers who are finding a livelihood in producing clothing for the local market. I mean, this could be the Ravi slum in Mumbai. It could be in Sao Paulo. It's a global feature of clothing production. And of course, these informal workers are undermining the established trade unions' conditions. Because you have in the clothing sector an existing trade union. So the question really is, how do you organize these informal clothing workers? There is an established clothing and textile workers union which tried to recruit these informal workers into the union. They failed because these are large, small-scale family enterprises where the employer-employee relationship is blurred. They may be family members, but it's difficult to mobilize them. And indeed, when the union tried to organize them, they tried to evade the union because they saw the union as possibly pushing them out of jobs because they were working below the minimum wage, and so they prefer to remain invisible, where they don't have to pay taxes and they don't have to have heavy travel costs into the city. But what was interesting, and this was the surprise for us, all of these men and women did belong to an organization. Not a trade union organization, but a faith-based organization. They belonged to the church, or they belonged to the mosque, or some other faith-based organization. Now, those organizations, of course, you may argue, are not trade unions, they are spiritual. But in fact, they're not spiritual organizations only, they're in fact more than that. They have to call it economic function. For migrants, they help them find jobs in the city when they come across the border from Zimbabwe, or from Malawi, or from Nigeria. They help them find accommodation in the city. And they even help them convey their money, that kind of informal banking. You carry back money to your village because you don't trust Mugabe in Zimbabwe, but you do trust your co-religionists to carry the money. You give them 100 rand and they take 10 rand and you ensure that the money gets to the village. So the outcome of our research on this was to point towards, if you like, a hidden source of power. What I'm calling not structural power, which they have very limited power, or associational power, or institutional power, but what they have potentially, and it's a potential obviously that has to be realized, a potential to make a coalition, a loose alliance with the faith-based organizations in order to build their organization. So my first example really is a suggestion of how it's possible through using a power resources analysis to identify hidden or untapped sources of power, in this case, new sources of power that go beyond the workplace. My second example is these wine workers in the Western Cape of South Africa. Now, we produce, of course, as is well known, the best wine in the world. These men, of course, realize this, and they have a great deal of strategic power, and they're expressing it right there. That's a clear example of structural power, namely blocking the main road that runs from Johannesburg through to Cape Town, the key artery. So they're blocking it, but they're not only blocking it, and they're making a demand there, essentially to increase the wage by 50%. They're also burning that's fire, and on the right-hand bottom corner, the burning of the fields. It's a kind of structural power. It's a disruption. It's a disruption of the production process, and as such, it's an example of structural power. And it's a mass action. It's a disruption, but it fails to build sustainable organization. The workers on the wine claims of the Western Cape disrupted public spaces, occupied the main road, structural logistical power, won support in the community, it's a kind of social, and the social media. They happened to achieve their wage demand through the state use of structure, because there was a minimum wage for that section that was doubled. But the collective action has not led to sustained unions, no associational power, and no consolidation of the gains through institutional power, and many of the gains they won are lost. So I'm using those examples, if you like, of a failure to utilize all the dimensions of power. And I want to turn now to my first example of success, which is the textile union of Nigeria, and the research of Ishmael Bello. Now, 30 years ago, Nigeria had 500,000 textile workers, one of the largest unions in Nigeria. They had strong structural associational power with a strong labor regime. Then the government liberalized, opened up, Chinese competition undercut the industry through the structural development program in the 1980s. And there was a steady decline of the union. It almost wiped out the union. And they decided, well, we have to rethink our position if we want a future. We need, and this is a key concept here, we need to make a choice. We need to make a strategic choice to build organization at the branch level and recruit the self-employed tailors. Now, what you had in the industry were these factory workers were declining, and then you had self-employed tailors, informal workers. And they decided that they had to rebuild the union by crossing that divide, by bringing in the tailors, the self-employed. How did they do it? Well, the first thing they did was to bring in 5 young, vibrant organizers. They linked up with a union in South Africa to get ideas. They retired the long service organizers, all those over the age of 60 were retired, and they expanded recruitment to include the tailors and the garment workers, if you like, the informal. So they crossed the divide. Now, of course, the tailors had different interests. Well, the tailors are concerned that they're self-employed tailors, they're interested in credit, they're interested in the problems with excessive taxation and the harassment from the government. But they also had certain common interests, and the common interests with factory workers were that they needed regular electricity. We have this phenomenon of outages of electricity, and it's absolutely vital to maintain the machines. They wanted to block the illegal imports of clothing, and of course safety. So there, if you like, there were differences in crossing the divide, but there were common interests. And applying the power resources approach here, the increased capability, which rose from appointing new organizers to expand associational power amongst informal workers, expanding societal power through campaigns and bringing the public on side through the media and civil society, and of course getting support from the global union, industrial all. And this drew strategically on the institutional power through policy dialogue with the government and the Employers Association, and this particularly customs and excise, because they control the flow of imports and goods. And most importantly, there was a degree of organizational flexibility here that we actually have to think completely different as to who our constituency is. And of course, there was organizational learning through intensive education. Now, so that's an example of the union turning around through strategic use of power and crossing that divide by tapping into the informal organizers. My last example, fourth example, is what those are what are called border. Border is essentially a substitute for the collapse of the public transport system, and where the drivers take passengers. You fit a bicycle with a padded cushion on the rear carrier, and you can actually motorize it and turn it into a motorcycle. So here, the city then is, like any African city, like many cities in the third world, has these large numbers of informal, self-employed border drivers. And the word border, which has become is derived from the word crossing the border from Uganda into Kenya, and it's a corruption of the English word border. Originated as a bicycle, and then it was motorized, and its popularity is associated with the convenience of it and the ability to meet demands of the passengers and traffic jams in urban centers, on top of being a cheap means of transport. How did there was an existing union of transport, a general workers union of Uganda. How did they organize the informal and merge the formal informal by introducing one union? And here I'm drawing on the study of Dave Spooner and John Mark from Uganda. What they did was, I think a key actor here was the International Transport Federation, which gave them money to and launched a project on organizing transport workers. They took their union, another key point, out of the union into the university on a sponsored course so they could start to think differently. They engaged in a mapping exercise to identify the different associations, but there were associations there, and they established an informal sector committee, brought them all together, and this led to a new form of trade union organization. I think this is the key point that starting to think differently of what a union organization looked like. They got a quick win by getting parking for these border drivers at the airport. The police withdrew, and the union grew. And here's the good news: from 5,000 members in 2012 to 92,000. Of course, mobile phones and things like that helped them organize the key role of the global union. Of course, there are many challenges still. I mean, the question is, how do they pay the same fees? And but no longer is there police harassment. There's a massive growth, and I thought this is particularly interesting of women members, who for the first time were getting protection from harassment and so on, and they joined the union. Again, it's a use of power. They had considerable structural power because you can disrupt urban transport if you all stop work. But they had little associational power until they merged, formal and informal. And the formal transport workers have now got some institutional power, informal workers less so. But the formal transport workers have some respect. Of course, people are still suspicious of these taxi drivers. I think it's a difficult thing to give equal status to these formal and informal workers. Difficult building solidarity across that divide. And the transition to a fully integrated union hasn't really taken place yet. The International Transport Federation was crucial, the global union. Whether this is replicable in other countries is an interesting point. But I'm giving then, just by way of conclusion, what are the possibilities and limits of the power resources approach? I've given you two examples here of failure, two examples of success. I think the crucial first step is what one could call strategic choice. That in fact, and I guess this is the optimism, that the decline of trade unionism is not like the rising of the sun. It's not inevitable. It's something that depends on choices. And these are strategic choices. And I've given you two examples of how through smart strategic choice they were able to reverse the decline and actually expand dramatically the union in Africa. I think mapping, you need to identify who these workers are, what their sources of power. For example, the case of the clothing workers in Johannesburg, the idea, which was totally counterintuitive to me, that you could actually think of the church as a potential coalition partner, but that arose out of us doing the research and mapping in that area. Alliances are crucial. If you're going to structural power plus alliances is, I guess, a nice little formula. Again, if you're going to think differently, you have to, if you're going to reverse the decline, you're going to have to think differently, flexibly, learn, and you have to try and build consensus if you're going to tap into these new sources of power. Just to conclude, my last point, Chair, is I think that it's important to recognize different social contexts. I mean, the context in Africa is, as it is in India, is a massive and growing informal economy. So that's the challenge for Labour. It's not the same challenge in Germany or the United States. It's a different kind of challenge. So I think I'm not wanting to present, and my colleagues don't want to present to you a kind of simple formula, but a challenge and how one could rebuild the labour movement in your own region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation indeed. Highlighting the strategy of trade unions through power resources and emphasizing the informal sector, which is very distinct from the formal sector and compared to the developed countries in South Africa or India. So third presentation is by Paula and Clair. This is on power of workers, streets and talks on democracy, the Brazilian case. You have 15 minutes. There is an announcement. Everybody is requested to assemble near Nehru statue in the convention center lobby at 2:15 p.m. 2:15 p.m. sharp for a group photograph. Yes, you can start, please.
So our paper will discuss what happened in Brazil in the last years, but specifically what happened on the streets of Brazil. And also we will look at what CUT, which is CUT, National Confederation of Trade Unions in Brazil, also their view of what was happening on the streets, and also what was the results of all what happened in the streets, whatever. So in June 2013, there was massive manifestations in the country. It started actually in São Paulo with a movement pushed by a movement that was defending free pass, for people not to pay for the transportation fees in the city, because the government of the city of the state of São Paulo informed he was going to increase the price of the tickets. So it started actually not so big, but because of the use of the violence and the policy, the police actually, somehow it boosted these demonstrations. Many people started to support them, and even in other cities of Brazil also they started to support and also to protest also against other increases also in the bus tickets. In addition to this, we also had the World Cup that was coming in 2014 and the Olympic Games in 2015. So there was also a kind of dissatisfaction with the investments, the high investments to these two sports events. And of course also corruption that at that time we didn't have a notion what was it actually. But also this was one of the elements on the dissatisfaction of these groups. So people on the streets in the beginning, they were talking about, it's not about the 20 cents, it's about rights. They said also school standards, FIFA, and also for a world without transness. So here, just for you to have a notion of what was happening in June, this was one of the demonstrations in June, early June. Here you have some people, it's written, it's not about 20 cents. Here you have one of the main phrases, let's say, of the MPN, which was, if the tariff doesn't go down, São Paulo will stop. And then after this, as many people attended the protest, there were also forces that started to use these protests for their own interests, for their own agenda. So important to analyze also who were on the streets. So some academics, they made some studies, and André Singer said that it was a mix, but mainly composed by medium class, and also by what he calls new proletariats. And Giovanni Alves also gave a different name, precariado, but mainly with the same idea, urban workers with high education skills, but with precarious insertion in the labor relations and social life. So here you have more or less, it's difficult to see here, but most of them, so youth people with high education. But regarding the income, you can see that majority of them were earning around 2 to 5 minimum wages, so low income, majority low income. Then, as the proposal of the article was also to look at CUT's view on this, it was clearly also that the demands that were in the streets were very similar or almost the same of the demands that CUT and other progressive social movements were demanding for a long time. So in this way, also CUT analyzed the situation and said that to consider these changes, they thought it would be important to include a plebiscite on political reform, democratization of the media, tax reform, and other fundamental advancements to consolidate the project that has been going on for the last decade since Lula was elected as president of Brazil. Also, another thing important to say, the social media played an important role in the organizations of these demonstrations. And also, we can see that the people on the streets, they have an urgent demand for the right of auto-representation. The government response at that time, it was Dilma, president of Brazil, who actually should be the president still today, but anyway. She gave a very good answer to the demands that were signalized in the streets. She focused on 5 main points: fiscal responsibility, political reform, the question of health, public transportation, and education. I won't go into details, but in the paper you have even parts of what she defended and also parts of her speech, which was actually very good and complete. So, you can see the next one, sorry. Then what happened? We had elections, national elections. Dilma was re-elected, but the conservative sectors did not accept the results of the elections. So with the power of June 2013, with the demonstrations, right wing also started to organize and to occupy the streets. And some movements, let's say like this, were created, right-wing movements, as we call the Vem Pra Rua, which was created in 2014, right after the elections, actually. And also MBL, which actually is important to mention, it is financed by conservative parties, such as the PMDB, which is the party of the current illegitimate president of Brazil, and also Solidariedade, which the president of Solidariedade is the president of a trade union confederation in Brazil called Força Sindical, and also by some international forces as well, as the brothers. So here you have some of the pictures to see the division, because right wing went to the streets, but of course the progressive forces, they were always on the streets, and they also got organized. I will jump here. And I will jump also this one because we don't have much time. And from the progressive side, there was also an organization of 2 main fronts, which was the Front Popular Brazil, and the other one was People Without Fear. And only they had the main goals, the similar view of the situation. They had criticism about the economic and fiscal policies that unfortunately the Dilma's government adopted, that was different from what was her program when she was elected. And they also defended democracy against the coup. The difference between these 2 fronts is just that in the first one, some parties were part also, are part also of the front, and the People Without Fear, no. The first one, the landless movement, is part of it, and the second one, the housing without houses movement, is part of it. And then here, here you have Fuchs talking about the economic policy, which was inconsistent with the project supported by workers. And then you also have something that recently came up, is about the inequalities that actually the national income grew percentage, but actually most of it was appropriated by the richest people against the less favorable classes. Although many policies were implemented during Lula's mandate and also Dilma's mandate, as you all know, minimum wage will increase, Bolsa Família, etc. So you had different actors in the struggle against the coup or against the impeachment. Fiesp also, which is an employer organization, one of the it's the biggest actually in Brazil, which is from the São Paulo's employers, was in favor of the coup and actually also probably financed the coup. The main media played an extremely important role in this because they were supporting the coup. The composition of the parliament, one of the most conservative parliaments since the military dictatorships in the 60s, and also the judiciary system. So why it was accepted to be, why impeachment was accepted to be discussed at the Parliament of Brazil? Because Eduardo Cunha, president of the lower house and also member of the same party as Michel Temer, as I already said, that he's the current president of Brazil, he accepted the request to open the impeachment process. Because on that same day, the Workers' Party announced their vote against him because he was accused of corruption, and clearly he had secret accounts in Europe and involved in different scandals of corruption, and that's why he's in jail actually now. So I will pass now to Ana Paula, which is my friend. We work together.
So the result of the coup is a big social regression. Many ways in the Brazilian society, in the arts, in the public policies, in the trade union organization, and the labor law reforms, social security. In many ways, we are having the regression very, very hard. But I would like to share with Professor Webster the optimistic view about this, what is happening now. Because indeed, it's a decline of model of trade union organization. But also, in my view, it's an opportunity to start the new model of organization of trade unions. We are having now the chance of include informal workers to organize categories from different ways that we have now. We need to change it because of the labor law reform it's a very hard for trade union representation. We don't have anymore the same way of representation. We need to exchange it. It's not easy to trade unions because of we have some kind of status. The trade unions are very nice with this model of organization, but the law changed, so we need to change. If we could change it because of our own decision, we will change now. So it's an opportunity to break off corporativism. This is a very important thing I think we have in this time, this next time. It will be hard, of course. The decline of the trade union representation will be hard. We need to work very, very seriously in since the workplace representation to the national structure. But in my view, we have very serious problems in this year, next year, but it will start a new form of representation. We needed to make the trade unions to think about these social regressions and to see the trade union as democratic and legitimate representation of citizenship, not only about worker relations, labor relations. We will expand the trade union action of the trade union organization. This is a challenge, of course. It's not easy to do, but we are very decided to go this way. Okay.
Last presentation, which is not listed in the program. There is another presentation, last presentation, which is not listed in the program. This is by Magda on Brazilian labor reforms.
We are going to divide with Campos.
No?
Oh,
At the end,
he will also be too?
No, he's with me. We discussed this at CIT. There we have the common analysis.
Oh,
So he
I
can.
will answer the question.
Okay.
so you have 15 minutes?
Yeah.
You have 15 minutes?
Yes, can you tell me when I have 5
Yeah,
minutes?
I will just remind you when 2-3 minutes are left.
Fine.
Okay, I will do that.
I'm a little bit slow.
We will
Okay, I have a little problem because I'm too small, just like the freedom. So this is the reason I have to talk here because you won't see me. Well, I thank you very much, the organization, because we didn't send this paper. I talked with Mark Ann and with Namhata, and so it's a generosity from them to be able to present you what's going on in Brazil, considering to our labor reform. So, in a certain aspect, is an expression of what Professor Carlos Salas talked this morning, and of what Clair and Anna and Melli talked about now. So because the labor reform, we consider the labor reform as one of the expressions or one of the reforms of this new model of society and of state they are trying to
concretize in our country. But it's not new. It's not something new. This is what's important to underline. It's not something new. We have, as Professor Carlos Sala said this morning, trying to understand what's going on in Brazil and trying not to have persons that or parties that are guilty for this. We try to understand our social structure. We try to understand what's going on in our country of 100,000 miseries. This is a very good Brazilian writer that said Brazil is a country of 100,000 miseries. Okay. So this is the reason we discuss our reform, our labor reform, as one of the expressions of this new structural reforms that this group that took power in our country last year tries to concretize. The first one, the first structural reform that this group tried to concretize was the reform that frozen the public spending for 20 years. So this was approved by our parliament, and it was a PEC. PEC is an amendment for the Constitution. It needs a special process, and we approved this. Our country approved this last year, and this PEC frozen our public expending for 20 years. So this was our first structural reform we had since this group took power in our country. But this group is not a new group. Okay? This group participates, in the suicide of Getúlio Vargas. This group, of course, now they are grandfathers, great-granddaughters, great-granddaughters, but it's the same interests. Our elite, that is an elite that has this kind of complexion, has this kind of will, and this kind of desire. So this group frozen our public expending for 20 years, and this is something very nasty and terrible for our policies, public policies, for education, for health, and everything. We are already suffering the consequences of this, because in the universities we already have cuts of scholarships, of becas, we have cutting of a budget, we have cutting of budget in health, etc., etc. Well, the meaning of this, the essence of this, is taking off the state from the coordination of all the process of developing our economy, or the process of developing public policies in order to integrate in a better way our society. So there was the first structural measure they approved last year. And after this, we had it's still not approved. We have the social security reform that is going on, and has the same meaning, has the same face. This social security reform is so nasty that the population, even though we have the medias, the population realized what does it mean, and the population went on the streets, and up to now they couldn't approve yet this reform, and the resistance is being so important and so effective that up to now this reform was not approved yet. The other reform that was approved is the labor reform. The labor reform, we analyze this as an expression of this new performance of this group that took out the power, and using the parliament, using the judicial power that had a very important participation in this CUP, and this group has an idea, right? And has its aims, its own aims, and all his policies, the policies of this group, are supported by a plan that is an austerity plan that goes on in our country. But I said it's not a new group. This group is there in the structure of our society because we have, a society, a slavery and monoculture inherited that is still on, and we didn't overcome. Even though we had important moments of our country that we almost overcame. We did important achievements during periods in our country. And all those important achievements we had in our country, they were all achievements that try to integrate our society, try to reduce our important and deepening difference that we have, and try to organize our society in a more equal way, in less unjust way. And so this group that has this idea is a group that has its origin. But not only this, we say that all over the world, you have, and you know this, you face this, and all the papers presented this here. All over the world we have this movement, that's the movement that we call the globalized capitalism, that is, it has a prevalent financial future, and it's going on all over the world to try to satisfy its unsatisfiable, or never be able to be satisfied desire of accumulating richness. So that goes all over the world. And in our country, this movement got deep its action in 214, 215, when we had a very important political and economical crisis. So this movement found an environment that made it easier to take the power, and also found our social structure where slavery, or a slavery society, and where a society where the oligarchies have power, finally got together and made the cup possible. Well, what is this labor reform? This labor reform is a strategy in order to destroy all the mechanisms or all the ties we had to regulate publicly capitalism or the capital. So this reform has a meaning, a goal, that is to destroy any possibility of public regulation or social public regulation. Why this? Because we understand labor law as a reaction of times when the liberal order collapsed. And as the liberal order collapsed in the 19th century and in the 19th century, the answer was anti-liberal, and all over the world, in a democratic or a non-democratic way. But in the 20s, at the beginning of the 20th century, and basically after the Second World War, the answer was anti-liberal all over the world, even in a democratic or even a non-democratic way. And labor law is an expression of the reality. This is the way we understand labor law, as a policy, a very important policy that dismercantilized the relations between laborers and the employers. So labor law is an obstacle for the free action of the unundribbled capitalism. So as it is an obstacle, we have to destroy those obstacles. And not only labor law, but all the institutions that concretize labor law. So our labor reform has three elements that are quite important. First, we have to destroy a public social regulation, or the social protection of the workers. Second, we have to destroy the mechanisms that investigate if we are applying or not those social protections, and the mechanisms that are trying to concretize those social protections, and the unions. So there are four elements that the labor reform tries to destroy in order to eliminate all the obstacles of the free trade of the undribbled capitalism. Okay. And it found in our society material conditions to do this, to concretize this, due to our inhibition not overcame, that we not overcame. And it's so real that we not overcame that when we, in our countries, try and are getting, to construct better society, those people that are trying to construct better society are overthrown. And that's happened with Getúlio Vargas, and that's happened with Alakh, the president in '64 that had a cup. And now got with President Dilma that represent this movement toward the construction of a better society. So labor law has its future. And why do I say this? Because labor law destroys the sources of the reform, the labor law reform, destroys the sources of labor law, that is the universal law, the Constitution, and CLT, our labor code, tries to destroy it and to make prevalent the individual wills. That means what we workers individually and employers agree in a space with no obstacles is going to be prevalent. And in this meeting, individual meeting, workers and employers, we are going to find harmoniously the better point to construct the better norm or the better regulation. This is the essence of our labor reform that has just been approved. So we throw away the unions, we throw away the state, and we permit that individuals that are equal, I'm being sarcastic, that we allow individuals that are equal because they all were born nude, so they are equal, to get together in a space without no obstacles to find the best individually, because we are rationals and we are intelligent. So we are going to find the better place to write the better norm that is going to regulate our individual relationships, our relationships from individuals with groups, groups with groups, and groups with nations, nations with nations. This is the essence of our labor reform that says that the individuals can decide. You throw away the unions and throw away the universal law. The individuals can decide about wages, can decide about working hours, can decide about everything that is the test. The law said how we had to organize it, because law has this universal feature. And now we are going to go back to a period where the individuals, rational individuals, are going to decide, because they are meritocratic and they are intelligent and rational, they are going to decide what is best for them and for society. This is the essence of our labor reform. There is a theory behind it. There is a theory behind it. I don't need to tell you what does it mean. There is a theory behind this. But there are other aspects that are very terrible also. The unions are eliminated from when we are going to decide the representatives in the local of the work, in the plant, in the factory. The reform brings you a local organization of the workers, but the unions do not participate in this choice. So, and this representation has the power also to decide the best rules to regulate the relationships. And also, the labor justice that in Brazil, not the Supreme Court, the labor justice that in Brazil has had up to now a very important role, in order to guarantee those social laws. The labor justice also has been abolished from this reform, because we create onus, we create difficulties to go on, because now you have to pay to demand in labor justice. You have to pay the tax, you have to pay the lawyer of the other, you have to pay for pericias, I don't know how you say this, so in order to see if it's your situation as insalubridade or not. And so you create difficulties, in order to go to the judicial power. So this is our reform. It's much more than the negotiation overcomes the law. It's much more than that, because you abandon the collective space of constructing the norm. And you go back to the 19th century to find in the individual's wills the best way of regulating harmonics our society. This is the main, and this is the, I won't have time to specify, to prove you, because we have many articles. And we also give you the employers have multiple choices. So they are going to allocate the workers as they want it, because, or they can allocate using, for instance, part-time job, or they can allocate, for instance, using 0-hour job, as they did in the United Kingdom, or they can allocate all of them as empresários, how do you say? Entrepreneurs. All of them as individual entrepreneurs. And also you can allocate all of them as autonomous. And there is an article that says the worker is autonomous even though he works with exclusivity, continuity to the same employer. So this is autonomous. And it says, and in this case, if you contract somebody as autonomous, we don't have to use the Article 2 and 3 of our code that says that worker, employer, employer is the one that sells its labor force in a subordinated and remunerated way. And so now we have the autonomous. So everyone can be autonomous, and this is not a labor contract, this is a civil contract, and because we are all creative, and this is going to be better for our society. So I'm not going to make the critics of this because I don't have time, but this is the essence of our reform. Some years ago, we had a GLU meeting where we took a denounce of PL 4330 that broadened the possibility of contracting outsourcing way. This is much worse because this reform also permits you contract outsourcing way with no obstacles. In our country, we have some obstacles in a judgment proceeding. Now you have no more obstacles, and everybody can be outsourced worker because it's interest. You are going to create much more jobs, and it's going to be good for them. This is a myth. This is a false idea, and we know this is a false idea. So this is our reform. Now we're going to, we can, in the questions, the discussion, we can probably complete this. My time finished, but we say that with this reform, there is something that we have to say also. This is a non-constitutional reform. This is an infra-constitutional reform. That means this reform is inconstitutional. CUT has denounced it already to OEA and to ILO. So those international organizations are going to analyze this. At this moment, we don't believe too much in our Supreme Court because we are going to have only 3 votes in our Supreme Court.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for disturbing you.
No, sorry.
So we had 4 excellent presentations. We have around 30-35 minutes left for discussion. Your comments and questions are addressed to the speakers, paper presenters. Very brief, please introduce yourself. Yes, start.
My name is Gabriel. I'm also from Brazil, so I can make some kind of informed comments on my colleagues. First, Luis, we have a wall in Africa. This is for Morocco to West Sahara. I think it's important. Old walls since the 74, so it is it's the last colony of the world. We can call it. It's important to put. This is an almost forgotten population. The Sahrawis. And I have some remarks. I think maybe we can can understand better. First, about the protest of 2013, you stressed that there are low-income workers that were in the protests with 2 to 5 minimum wage. In Brazil, it's not low income. Indeed, 70% of the workers receive less than 2 minimum wage. So you can call them like higher income workers in Brazil. So they receive from 2 to 5 minimum wage. It can be not much, but in the structures of Brazilian society, they are high income. So, and we forgot to mention also the Dilma's measures that really weakened her from the process. Now, I'm a bank worker, so I used to work for a bank, National Savings Bank of Brazil, and she just got elected with the massive participation of our workers in the campaign. Most of the workers are supporting her actively, and 1 week after, she said she was planning an IPO of the shares of the bank that are now it's totally government owned. We see it as the first step for privatization. So this kind of measures that Dilma took that was really anticlimax, and then she started to apply a neoliberal recipes on our government. So it really took the only opportunity to be defended by the population. And this is one also thing. Even the right wing or the left wing in Brazil in this process, both were unable to mobilize the popular power, the real popular power. You both both of them the left have some attachments to social movements that we can call popular, but even this, they are not. The great majority of Brazil were not participating in this fight. This is one thing that we should address and make some way to achieve them. And to Magda, I see that your picture is kind of end of the world picture, but I would like to stress something also. First, the labor reforms, they not it will not they feel the same for different classes, we can call it. Because if you look to Brazil now, you have 70% of people receiving less than 2 minimum wages. These guys, they already don't have, they are or outsourced, yet they still working in precarious work or in informal sector. They don't have a formal job at all, or they are already outsourced. They don't have union, because the great majority of unions in Brazil, they only exist in paper. For these people, for the great majority of Brazilian people, the labor law will not change. You're not. That's why I participated in the build of mobilization against the labor law reforms, and it was so hard to communicate to the people. You can outsource the guy. Oh, but I am outsourced. Okay, so so they will take your union for. Yeah, I don't have a union. No, I have a union, but I never saw nobody of the union. So okay, so what can we talk about this?
Yeah.
So I'm finishing.
Please speak this.
Yeah.
There's several people.
Okay.
Yes, we will collect 2-3 questions and then come to the speakers. So you introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Natalia. I'm from Brazil too, LPG8. Actually, I have 2 questions very quickly, I promise. One for Webster. Actually, for me, your presentation was wonderful. I would love to read your full article about it. But I'd like to know more about these faith-based organizations' alliances, because in Brazil, this is a big issue that we discussed, and maybe, yeah, I think I would like to know more about it, because they are getting strong and strong and strong, and if we can build an alliance with them to have more proximities with precarious work would be wonderful. I have very difficulties to think about this possibility, so I'd like to know more about it and your thoughts. And the second thing is to my colleagues from Brazil. Actually, a wonderful presentation from everyone, and all the presentation was wonderful. But actually, I have a question. It's very interesting in your presentation, because in Brazil you have different interpretations about June days, the demonstrations of June. I'm from a part that thinks that this was important measure to understand the youth as an important actor of the political participation in Brazil. However, it's very interesting that this was in 2013, and now it's 4 years later, we are speaking about privatization. I know that in Cucci there is several sectors that were speaking about privatization before, but I'd like to know, or at least your thoughts, after 2013 and after to see this kind of youth as an actor, which kind of policies Cucci, or at least thought to do in the sense to revitalize and maybe have more political power to defeat the coup that we suffer and the labor reform and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Yes, please.
My name's Helen Russell. I'm a GLUE alumni from the UK and work for the Physiotherapists Union in the UK. I have two questions, very similar to Natalia's question to Eddie. I don't really understand why faith-based organisations would want to join with us in a coalition. Is there any evidence of that happening, apart from maybe in South Africa, where there's a Latin America, where there's a philosophy of liberation theology? I kind of understand that, but why would they want to link up with us when they're already strong, they already have their social networks, they're meeting their goals? Why do they need to link up with us? And then the other one is, Gabrielle, you said why the mass of the population did not join the fight against the coup. I just don't understand why not, because from kind of an external perspective, you know, we saw on the news the June days demonstrations, and then the next news in the UK was a right-wing coup, and I don't understand what the journey was. Were people just disillusioned with Dilma? Why did they not come out and fight and prevent the coup?
Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Well, you go ahead. Go ahead. I go after.
Okay. No, I didn't understand.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, it's up to you to pass, I know that.
Yeah.
But, so let me go to the point. Well, we live in a real phase of market authoritarianism in Brazil right now. And of course, we are all against the coup. All the progressive forces are against the coup. But I would like to send this first question to you, that I really like the presentation also, but don't you think that was in all the periods of Brazilian history when we had this class compromise, that we feed somehow the way of our enemies into power, and that happened in the 60s and also right now with this coup. When we build these alliances with our enemies, and at a certain point they go and kick us out of the power, I believe that we should be thinking about new alliances, that we can embed from the grassroots, that we can really bring them up, not so much favoring what's, it's just
Just speak into the mic, please.
not. The mic is broken. The mic is broken. So I speak like a trade unionist as I am. So not embed these alliances on just governance or the governments, but going to another sources, that's when I come to Eddie's question also. I believe that if we embed our new alliances, broadening, and then the discussion about the religious or NGOs or other things, not being so much not dependent on the government, but seeing that we have other ways to do it, to feed popular power, to bring it up, to build new alliances that will then embed these progressive forces to another way. If we don't do that, and then we finish with Luis saying, organizing everybody, being really internationalist, looking to the 21st century, not depending so much in the old structures and what we built before.
My name is Nilesh. I'm a Blue Brazil alumni. I'm Indian. And I work with the Safai Kamgar Union, which is a manual scavenging workers union. My point is actually to the whole panel. Professor Salas and Magda are my teachers, but also Professor Webster. The thing is, it is not true that the informal sector has no networks or the organizations. They're there, and in many cases they are faith-based. And I would say in one line as a conclusion, that's a lethal combination to bring the faith-based organization in the I would say in the arena of calling, let us say, labor unions also, because that will not really work as a productive source. Look at the history of India, that is proof. My point is that so that there are other networks, and we have to be more open-minded to understand that they may be occupation-based, they might be ethnicity-based, there might be other possibilities also, motivation-based. There are good examples across the space. If you look at the work in Brazil also, it is my own experience that faith-based organization has actually alienated themselves from a faith, and actually I have acted towards the goal of, I would say at certain level for the welfare of the worker. So it's quite possible, but I wouldn't really, from the tone of the room, I wouldn't really go to say that that would be the solution, and also a structural power organization. And the thing about, just out of thing, like I was in Brazil and I'm an outsider, I wouldn't say that even if 70% people do earn less than minimum wage, 2 or 3, there are many people which Professor Magda was actually hinting towards, they earn almost 20-25 minimum wage. So the question is about polarization, and that's why the middle class was on the street. And I would also say that for me, people do protested the impeachment. I saw that, and the media did not see it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, it doesn't work here.
Yes, yes.
It doesn't work. Oh, it doesn't work either. It's okay. I'm Elaine. I teach in Penn State University.
Your mic is not working?
It doesn't work.
No, it's not working anyway.
I don't think mine.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Elaine. I teach in Penn State. And I have a question for. Sorry.
From where?
I have a question for Luis and Eddie. When I was listening to both of your presentations, I was thinking, how can we apply the power resources approach to answer the question posed by Luis? Like, if we want to answer the questions of how trade unions should address the issues of migrant workers, in that context, how can the power resources approach help us to answer that questions? I just want to see how you two think about this.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, yes, speak loudly. Speak loudly. Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Nicolò Giangrande. I am a GLU alumni. Nowadays, I'm PhD student in Italy. My questions are for the about the Brazilian situation. I deem that the 2 terms of Lula and at least the first one of Dilma were very important because through the social policies that you explain and also the valorization of minimum wage and also for the labor force entrance in the formal sector led to the drop of Gini indicator and also the unemployment. But then arrived the coup, and this was a big problem because through the coup they could also implement labor reforms and restrictive fiscal policy. The labor reforms, it's obviously in this case it's in favor of the capital and against the workers. These change also the labor relation. I think that is the same model. They try to implement the same model that was applied in Europe, in the sense of low wage, less rights in order to be competitive with the other countries in the world. But this will lead to the drop of wage of the workers and also the consumption. So also there will be a problem for Brazil because there will be a decrease of aggregate demand. And on the side of restrictive policy, there is some signal that explain us that the government started to block the public expenditure just to attract FDI. So the alternative is completely another, I think, because should be done investment, public investment on infrastructure, and also the interest rate, a drop of interest rate. And maybe the mistake that have done in the past is to not implement the industrial policy in order to enhance the Brazilian productive structure. But since our situation, what is it the strategy, the exit strategy that Brazilian trade union can show us in order to exit of this situation? Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, please. Be brief.
To Professor Webster, is how do you in your power resource approach explain the failure and the success of the two different cases? Because knowing the four papers, I think the two failures was in South Africa, where the trade union movement is relatively strong, at least in institutional power. Structural power might be a discussion. And the two successes were in two situations where the unions had virtually collapsed. There are other examples and authors that argue that one of the main features of the renewal is when actually you don't have any of the sources of power you can draw on, and so you have to renew your approach because otherwise you disappear. Anyways.
Anyone? Okay, thank you very much. Many questions, many comments, and maximum to Edward Webster. So can we start? Can you conclude in 2 minutes, please?
Okay. Right. Look, thanks very much for just one. You know, I think the faith-based organisation. I'll respond to that, but that's a kind of throwaway. It's not the centre of my argument. It's the centre of argument is whether you could use this analytical framework of power resources to revitalise the union. And I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, let's treat that as injury time.
Okay.
I think that my answer to the question about the faith-based organisation would simply to stress the need for organisational flexibility. In other words, to think differently, and think maybe that we may end up with organisations that are very different from the past, hybrid organisations, a union and a cooperative, something very different. Secondly, we need to, the importance of my argument would be the need to look at the different social contexts. Now in South Africa, the church has played a central role in the struggle against apartheid. They were centrally involved in that, so they have a very high legitimacy. And in fact, the church is in the center of the area, became the center for all refugees, and they took it over basically. I suppose what I'm saying is, I'm trying to emphasize the point that you have to look at the particular case, and it may be very different in other cases. And that's the third point. I mean, I agree with the comment made that, and in a sense that's what I'm suggesting is, historically people have said, labour scholars, that the informal economy is unorganized. What we're suggesting is that they already are organized. In this case, they're organized into churches. So there are networks, and the question is how to tap those. Okay, so but let's not hinge the power resources on this particular case. But if I may very quickly respond to the question about migrants, I mean, I think that how I would use power resources, Elaine, isn't social power necessary here to draw more on the public, to get support through demonstrations on the streets and moral appeals in a situation where migrants are very vulnerable. But I mean, I'll leave it to Louise to answer that question. Thomas, how can you do this to me? A complicated question. Look, I think it's a very interesting question, and I mean, I think the point really is that what happened in South Africa. I mean, this is a one-liner. What's happened in South Africa is that institutional power has incorporated the unions, and there's been a disconnect between the institutions that were one and the organization on the ground. If you like, associational power, a disconnect between them. And I think that it's interesting in the case of Nigeria and the border, they had no institutional power. These border drivers, they had none. So they had to build up from the grassroots upward there and tap into associational power from below. So I mean, I sense yeah, that's my answer.
Echo, please, Luis.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that this issue about migrant workers and faith organizations, you could replace faith-based organizations with migrant-based organizations, and it's the same. Because I think that it's interesting because migrant workers are already organized everywhere. But there is a gap between the migrant workers' interests and the trade union interests. But they are already organized. A Guatemalan woman doesn't travel 5,000 kilometers to reach the United States if she doesn't know that there's an organization waiting for her there. Of course, it's not a trade union. It's another type of organization. But I think that the point, and Professor Webster taught us about that at Engage South Africa 2013, is that you need to know which are the main interests of those workers, which are the main problems, and you need to research. If you go and make interviews, surveys, and you find out which are the main problems of these workers, you could adapt your strategy as a trade union, to reach these workers. You know, because if these workers have problems to send money to their families, they need an organization to help them with that. It could be a faith-based organization, or it could be a trade union. If these workers have problems because they don't have documents, and they are facing the risk of the threat of being expelled from these countries, well, they need assistance to get these documents. And it could be, again, a faith-based organization, a migrant-based organization, any kind of organization. So, but you need to know that, and research is strategic for this point. But I think that for trade unions, there is an additional problem, because you cannot say, as a trade union, okay, we don't want you to come. But well, once you are here, we will try to organize you. But at the beginning, we don't want you to come, because we don't have labor here. You will increase the pressure at the labor market in my country, so we prefer you not to come. But well, once we are here, we'll try to organize you. There is a problem there. And at the same time, if these workers, if migrant workers, are facing the risk of being deported because they don't have documents, they will not they will not go to the union because the risk is really serious. So that's a problem. I think that as trade unions, we will need to adapt our strategies in order to reach this kind of workers, particularly migrant workers.
Thank you. Yeah, Claire.
No, okay. About low and high income, it's legitimate to question it. There are different interpretations, but I believe that familiar income of 2 to 5 minimum wages cannot be considered high income in Brazil.
Family income.
Yeah. Yeah. And yes, about the measurements that you said, that they implemented fiscal adjustment in Brazil, Dilma, especially in the second mandate, and also she made a very bad choice for the economic minister, financial minister, yeah. It's true, and Kut had a critical view actually about it, and not only Kut, all the progressive social movements. When you think about the fronts that were created, their main target or demand, whatever, was the criticism to these policies and the defense of democracy also, because one thing cannot substitute the other thing. We have also to divide the protests that happened in the beginning of June with the legitimate and very powerful force of the MPL, that they really grow in this moment in Brazil. But we know, all Brazilians especially here, that this movement was then co-opted by other forces, because in the beginning even they didn't want any parties, any social movements to be there. Remember, the flags were prohibited, everything. But this very important force of the early June demonstrations opened up the streets for even fascist forces. Remember, military, people were demanding military dictatorship in Brazil even. So it was a plurality of demands on the streets, and of course then co-opted afterwards by more divided left and right wing. Natalia, about the youth, of course Paula will also answer the questions, and she will give a more positive view. I will give more pessimist view. But I think still is a huge challenge for the labor movement, the youth. And I guess that this is one of the main challenges, I mean, for us, because I believe most of them don't recognize trade unions as allied. They criticize, they think it's too bureaucratic, part of the system, as said on the other session. Which kind of policies to revitalize? This is being discussed at CUT. Actually, we brought this document here. It's a project that we are doing. It's still under the way, but this later we can talk more about it. But we are discussing this internally at CUT, actually using Eddie Webster's classifications of revitalization. We are using similar elements that you mentioned.
Thank you.
Our paper is called The Powers of Workers on the Streets. That's why 2013, 2014, 2015, we had a lot of protests. In the beginning, Claire said what it was. But after 2014, after election of Dilma, and we had the trade union movement very strong. First of all, against the Dilma policies, against the neoliberal measures of Dilma. But after that, the trade unions organization go to the streets, go to the protests, and very strong mobilizations in favor of democracy against the coup. It was very strong in Brazil. Clair showed us many pictures on the paper about how Brazilian people was conscious about what means the coup. In the beginning, the coup was against only Dilma. People could think about, we don't want Dilma, we don't want PT anymore. We want the new government. But trade unions organization could show how the coup was against the workers' rights, against the citizenship, against the democracy. Then we could do the biggest general strike in Brazil this year in April. It was the biggest, the movement against the social security reform, the labor law reform, against the anti-democracy in the society. So we could change our action. That's we can show also how the alliances that we have made, it was very we have now very critical view, and it starts to making the new alliances. We have now two, we can say, struggle fronts, the Frente Brasil Popular and Frente Povo Sem Medo. That is a new alliance and a new form organization. Trade union are part of the trade union, they are most organized part of this front. But we have very important participation of youth, of landless, houseless, informal workers, and the formal workers not organized. This front right now is part of a new strategy of trade union action, trade union response on the measures that are made in Brazil come back to 100 years ago. Our this kind of alliance can bring different demands that not only come from the formal sector, that is not about the formal labor relationship. Right now we need to repose the needs of youth people that is not, they are not included in the formal sector anymore. The unemployment right now it's very high, so we need to talk much more with informal workers. They are part of this new organization. So thank you.
Yes, last.
That's my turn.
It's okay.
No,
he'll start, then
okay.
He's going to start because I talk, and then after I finish.
Well, he allows us. Just let me point out one important thing. The coup was not against unions, was not against organized workers, it was against the whole fabric of social fabric of the Brazilian society, the workers in general. No matter if they are registered, they are not registered, whatever. This is an overall offensive of neoliberal, extreme right-wing people. They are not kidding, they are not playing games. So, I don't think this is the time to start thinking about what to do until revolution comes. We have to resist, we have to reflect, and we have to react. And this is not the time to say, well, it was the fault of Dilma, it was the fault of Levy or PT or whatever. It was the fault of the whole Brazilian society that did not react to these internal fascist forces. And that's an issue that we have to take back home, reflect, and discuss in friendly terms. Not putting the blame on some specific group, oh, they didn't do what they had to do to make the revolution happen. It's important to have consciousness of the mistakes, but we can't spend all the time discussing the mistakes. Otherwise, they will destroy the society. And I think that's a very important thing that comes out of this discussion. It is not only the union, it is the people are being tried to destroy the rights, the possibilities of the future. It is not only the youth that is suffering. It will. The old people, middle-aged people, young people, and kids will suffer if we don't react. And the only way to which we can react is by union. I'm not discussing right now who had the major responsibility of the coup. We know how it happened. We know that it was planned. We know many things, and we will know many more things in the following years. But right now we have to resist first and then react. Otherwise we are lost. 20 years, 25 years of dictatorship is not an easy thing to live.
Thank you. Want to add anything?
Yes. I agree completely. I think that we need to make an exercise of tolerance and find our group. And our group is the group that wants to build a more equal society. I think this is the lesson we take from them. But what is important, your question you posed, labor reform is broad. It's deepened, and it's going to attack society, and it's going to attack Brazil, and it's going to attack our sovereignty. This is the reason they spend billions in amendments to buy the senators and to buy the deputies in order to approve. I was there, inside, discussing. Billions of reais in order to buy, to convince those senators that they had to apply the reform. And they all said, this is not enough, this is unconstitutional, but we cannot touch it. Because if we touch it, it's going to go back to the low chamber, and then we are not going to approve this. And we have to approve this rapidly. And they suggest to the president five vetoes, and he didn't veto. Okay? And so this is a very deep reform in the regulatory system in Brazil, the worst one we ever have seen in our country. We have never seen such a thing so deep as this labor reform. We thought they didn't have courage to do this. But it's terrible. We go back to the slavery times. We go back there. And it reached everybody. It reached everyone because no one in the last consequence, I'm dialoguing with the last consequence, no one will have any protection. Because everybody is going to be employer of itself. Okay? This is the consequence of our reform. And billions, if you were in the Senate, billions and billions the money were there, and if you were in the Senate, you would see all those boys with gel and like this, from other countries. We know the country defending this reform. So it were money it was spent there. Our sovereignty is there. So it means what the model we want to construct. So this is the reason I agree basically with Carlos, because we need to have tolerance in order to try to organize ourselves, because the illness, the badness is in society. They are not in the organisms. The what I want to show there is not that is the best, give you a best face of the world. No, it's to be pessimistic in the analysis, but in order to be optimistic in the action. We have done things, good things there. Myself, for instance, in our group at CESID, I belong to a group that Senator Paim is trying to analyze this and make an offer to society a new regulatory system. For instance, the CUT is trying to organize, and he organizes and participates. We have a forum that called FITS that is trying also to react on this. But for this reaction, we need unity. We need to know who is, in fact, our enemy. If we are going to blame ourselves and divide ourselves, we go nowhere. because what they want is to be individuals successful, each one being successful himself. So this is the reason we brought this situation here, in order for us to go back to our countries, trying to reorganize ourselves. Of course, there were a lot of mistakes. Of course, there are a lot of mistakes. But there are a lot of mistakes in Jânio Quadro, João Goulart. There are a lot of mistakes in Getúlio. But there are forces, important forces, that are taking over our country. They are selling everything. What we construct from 1930 to 1988, that is our constitution. This is a period, a very important period. We construct our social system. They are destroying in 6 months. So if we don't do anything, if we don't organize ourselves to fight against this, it's something terrible, because Brazil is a reference for Latin America, not only for Latin America. Brazil is a reference. Okay?
Thank you, everybody. It is very interesting. Thank you very much for your contribution to this and very interesting session indeed. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your